Welcome to the U.S. Access Board's forum titled Inclusive Design of Autonomous Vehicles, a Public Dialogue. This is the third session in series. Today's topic is Accessibility for Passengers with Sensory and Cognitive Disabilities, Part 1, Ride-Hailing and Onboard Communications.
Great. My name is Victor Pereira. I am a public member of the U.S. Federal Access Board and also a professor of urban planning at the University of California, Berkeley. I want to welcome everybody for this very important dialogue with some really incredible speakers. This is the third session of the U.S. Access Board's AV Forum on inclusive design of autonomous vehicles. The topic could not be more important, as cities around the world are deploying, contesting, and piloting technology that has tremendous implications for the lives of persons with sensory or cognitive disabilities. And that is the topic of today's discussion. When we think about ride hailing and onboard communications, we want to make sure that nobody is left behind. We want to make sure that there are clear standards, guidelines, but most importantly, we want to all be on the same page of understanding what is the future we want. This session follows two earlier ones that focused on access for passengers with mobility disabilities. And those happened on March 10th and March 24th. Autonomous vehicles really is not a thing of the future. It's a thing of the present. And the smart cities around the world, it's a term that's being used really for a much bigger transformation. It's a digital transformation. Historically, we've had various types of infrastructure in cities, such as power, road, sewage, gas. We have this other layer, which is a digital layer, digital infrastructure that these autonomous vehicles are going to be working off of, right? The goal of this forum is to collect and share information on designing these autonomous vehicles so that everybody can benefit from and contribute to building that new infrastructure. It's not only about being recipients or being consumers of this technology, but also thinking about how individuals with vision impairments, deaf or hard of hearing, cognitive disabilities, or individuals with mobility aids and wheelchairs can really be actively engaged in shaping this future. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon and turn it over to Sarah Presley of the board, who will introduce the guest presenters. Sarah, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor. And just before we get started on today's agenda, please note that the Access Board is not undertaking rulemaking on autonomous vehicles at this time. The board is conducting these sessions solely for the purpose of exchanging facts and information about the accessible design of autonomous vehicles and to hear thoughts from individuals on how to ensure that AVs are accessible to and usable by persons with disabilities. Our speakers have been invited to share information related to the accessible design of AVs. However, their inclusion in this panel does not constitute an endorsement by the Access Board or by any of our federal agency partners of any product, service, organization, or technical solution. We do have a packed agenda today. We will first be hearing from Dr. Cecilia Fili and Andrea Lubin from Rutgers University. Next, we will hear from Dr. Robin Brewer from the University of Michigan. She will be followed by Anil Lewis from the National Federation of the Blind. And our final speaker for today will be Dr. Christian Vogler. After the presentations, we will move to open discussion, giving attendees an opportunity to ask questions and make comments. And just again to remind you that the PowerPoint for this presentation is available for download at our website, www.access-board.gov/AV as an autonomous vehicles /. Okay, next slide, please. There are 3 ways you can participate in today's event. First, after each presentation, our moderator, Bruce Bailey, will take a couple of questions for the presenters. Please submit your questions at any time using Zoom's Q&A feature. There is no need to wait until the end of a presentation to submit a question. After each presentation, our moderator will read questions and give the presenters a chance to respond. Second, you may participate in today's event by contributing to the open discussion portion. Using Zoom's Q&A feature, indicate your interest in participating in the open discussion, and please include your name, organization, and the nature or subject of your comment, and include the word microphone if you wish to speak. Again, you may indicate your wish to participate in the open discussion at any time during the event. If you have been queued up to speak, the host will let you know ahead of time via the chat feature and will enable your microphone. The moderator will then announce when it is your turn to unmute yourself and speak. If you wish to be visible for signing during this open discussion, please indicate that in your request. If you are calling in today instead of using Zoom, or if you are having difficulty using the Q&A feature, you may email your request to speak to events@access-board.gov. Finally, after today's event has concluded, thanks to our partners at the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the Department of Labor, the dialogue continues online at transportationinnovation.ideascale.com. If you have not already done so, please register to contribute comments on this dialogue. Next slide, please. And now I would like to introduce our first presenters, Dr. Cecilia Fili and Andrea Lubin. Dr. Cecilia Fili joined the Center for Advanced Infrastructure and Transportation at Rutgers University in 2010 as a Transportation Autism Project Manager. Her research addresses transportation and mobility issues and obstacles from a multimodal perspective for individuals on the autism spectrum and individuals with other developmental disabilities. Her recent work involves analyzing the accessibility of autonomous vehicles and shuttles and how virtual reality, including mixed and augmented, can help teach pedestrian skills. She received her PhD in transportation from the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Next slide, please. Andrea Lubin is a senior researcher at the Alan M. Voorhees Transportation Center at Rutgers University. Ms. Lubin has over 15 years of experience in transportation policy planning, research, analysis, and outreach. Her research expertise is focused on investigating the mobility needs, issues, and experiences of persons considered transportation disadvantaged, specifically persons with a diverse array of disabilities and older adults. She holds a Master of Science degree in Public Policy from Rutgers University. Dr. Fili and Ms. Lubin, welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. We truly appreciate the opportunity to present some of our research with you today at the U.S. Access Board's Spring Forum on Inclusive Autonomous Vehicles. I am Cecilia Fili, and today I will be presiding with my colleague, Andrea Lubin. Andrea and I have collaborated on a number of research projects over the past 15 years, exploring mobility issues and needs of persons with disability. Specifically today, we will be sharing highlights from focus group work conducted in the spring of 2019 that gathered important feedback from persons with sensory and developmental disabilities related to their direct experience of riding in an autonomous shuttle here in New Jersey. Our work was funded in part by the USDOT's Office of Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology, and this research was undertaken as a collaborative initiative between Rutgers University and Princeton University. Next slide, please. So to begin, our project objective was to contribute to the limited body of research designing and employing autonomous vehicles, or AVs, in order to accommodate the diverse needs of persons with disabilities. To achieve our objective, we convened a series of 4 focus group sessions to capture the feedback from adults with visual impairments and/or developmental disabilities following the user experience of an autonomous shuttle ride. Next slide, please. So why focus on autonomous vehicles? Well, as we are all aware, access to transportation is essential for anyone to become fully integrated into society. And for persons with disability who are recognized as a transportation disadvantaged population, relying on public transit and other non-driving options can be necessary to achieve inclusion and to meet the trip needs. It is very likely that in the near future, the dynamic field of AV technology will be capable of offering a viable mobility option to the transportation disadvantaged population, including persons with disabilities. However, there's limited research focused on investigating strategies for designing and deploying AVs so they can best accommodate and be inclusive of persons living with one or more disabilities. We want to also point out that regarding AV innovation and adoption in the US, while both the US DOT and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration have been supportive of AV technology development, and while federal legislation on AV remains absent, many states are moving forward in exploring and adopting AV-related legislation and policies. Next slide, please. Regarding our study methodology, we convened 4 focus group sessions during a 2-day period with a total of 21 adult participants with developmental or visual disabilities. These sessions were held on Princeton University campus immediately following a brief ride given to participants on the Local Motors Ollie AV shuttle, which is an autonomous electric shuttle. The pictures on the screen show the research team and both the outside and the inside of the Ollie shuttle that we used. I want to point out that due to the state legal restrictions, the vehicle was limited to operating on the Princeton University campus football field instead of on local roadways. And due to these unique conditions of the testing environment, an onboard operator was on board for the trip. And I should note that the operational interface was very discreet and the vehicle was navigated by using a small joystick. Next slide, please. The majority of our participants reported being aware of self-driving AV or self-driving autonomous vehicles, or AV. However, most possess extremely limited knowledge on the technology. The current transportation modes that they were using varied and included fixed route public transit, ADA complimentary paratransit, ride-hailing services such as Lyft or Uber, school transport, and some self-driving. The travel mode reported by the vast majority of participants with developmental disabilities was as a passenger in a vehicle driven by a family or friend. So who were our participants in terms of demographic characteristics? As this slide shows, the majority were male in the age range of 22 to 29 years old and resided with their parents. There was some racial diversity among the participants, with 19% identifying as white Hispanic and 14% as Asian. The sample also demonstrated a range in the educational levels attained, and I want to note that all of the study participants were medically diagnosed with a disability. Next slide, please. So now to our findings. Each focus group session began immediately following the participant experience of riding the Ollie AV shuttle. These sessions were co-moderated by Andrea and myself. Key questions focused on capturing information on the full experience the participants encountered with the AV, from the first exposure to entering the vehicle, and then riding the vehicle to exiting the vehicle post-trip. Now, regarding the initial first impressions of the AV shuttle, notably the feedback communicated by all was overwhelmingly positive. Regarding the AV's appearance, comments included, "It looks so cool, it's amazing," or "It looks so futuristic." All the participants reported that the experience in both entering and exiting was easy and smooth. Participants who were visually impaired specifically remarked that they appreciated the lower step between the ground and the floor of the autonomous vehicle. They also added that the handrail on the step was very helpful with entering and exiting the vehicle. Next slide, please. So the participant on the trip itself was also positive, with all indicated they enjoyed the short journey. Words frequently used to describe the trip included comfortable, smooth, quiet, and slow. Several noted that they actually appreciated the slow travel speed as it helped ease them with the vehicle safety concerns. While also specifically discussing the topic of onboard sounds and noises, as persons with developmental disabilities, including autism, often experience auditory sensitivities. However, only one participant remarked of hearing any onboard travel noise. All the others shared that the ride was pleasantly quiet. Other facets of the trip experience discussed by participants focused on positive feedback related to the vehicle's large windows and the onboard video monitoring screens visible to the passengers. This made them feel more secure during the trip. Now I will pass it along to Andrea, who will share the conclusions of our findings.
Thanks so much, Cecilia, and good afternoon, everyone. So how did our participants feel about using autonomous vehicles moving forward? Notably, 17 of the 21 participants, the overwhelming majority, reported that they were interested in traveling again in an AV based on their positive trip encounter. And they shared preference for AV over other modes, particularly if made available on demand. Commentary from the 17 participants focused on the opinion that availability of the AV travel option would facilitate much needed travel freedom and increased independence, especially because so many participants discussed the challenges of being dependent on family for transportation. Next slide, please. Participants were also extremely eager to share with us the multitude of destinations and trip types they would seek to access utilizing an autonomous vehicle. Common responses we heard included employment, college or other continuing education opportunities, and daily living trips such as shopping. Several participants also mentioned they would use AV as a feeder to public transit. Notably, participants in each of our sessions were most excited to discuss the numerous social and recreational places of interest that they would seek to access using AV. A final topic discussed related to participant interest in utilizing AV was desire and/or need for personal assistance as an AV passenger. The majority reported that they do not typically utilize such assistance with their current mode or modes and would not need such assistance when traveling on an AV, at least not in the long term, with several participants with developmental disabilities indicating, however, that they would like the option of a family member accompanying them on AV trips until they felt comfortable traveling independently on this new mode. Notably, several participants with visual impairments shared that it would be helpful if assistance was always available to open and close vehicle doors, to provide guidance to available seats, to help with passenger bags, and to secure wheelchairs and/or other mobility devices. Next slide, please. It's important to note that almost all participants stressed that AV should be designed fully accessible, facilitating usage among persons with diverse disabilities. Our focus group participants also shared a variety of specific concerns with self-driving vehicles, as well as recommendations, with core issues focused on the topics of accessibility, vehicle safety, comfort and design, cost and availability, and the vehicle's communication interface. While communication accessibility is the focus of the forum today, we want to share with you quick highlights of the feedback shared on these other specific concerns as well. Safety-related AV concerns were the most discussed issue, and numerous recommendations to ensure optimum safety were suggested, including usage of onboard cameras to capture safety-related incidents, as well as audio and visual sensors that can assist the AV in identifying and responding appropriately to approaching emergency vehicles. Recommendations to address vehicle malfunction or accident concerns focused on presence of an onboard attendant. Next slide, please. Also related to safety was a discussion on the vehicle communication interface. Participants shared many questions related to the AV interface, primarily focused on how passengers were supposed to indicate their destination and schedule their trip. They wanted to know if they would be able to do so using the GPS technology on their cellular smartphones, which most indicated would be ideal, or if they would instead need to indicate their destination upon boarding the vehicle. Some were interested in better understanding the capabilities of the onboard interface in terms of engaging in a two-way dialogue or conversation with the AV on various topics, such as the day's weather, while others wanted to know if they could secure needed assistance while traveling via the interface. Several recommended that the onboard communication interface should permit passengers to access a call center to secure live operator assistance, especially vital in the event of an emergency. Next slide, please. Regarding vehicle design, participants with visual impairments noted that several design features should be incorporated, including utilization of contrast, texture, and color on any vehicle steps, installation of a handrail on the vehicle exterior near the entrance, and utilization of a non-slip finish on the vehicle step or steps and flooring. Finally, vehicle availability and cost factors were discussed as concerns. Regarding availability, participants emphasized that they were eager for AV to function as an on-demand transport mode, similar to ride-hailing options, and that usage would not require advanced reservations. Participant discussion on cost concerns assumed they would be paying for passenger trips on an AV as opposed to purchasing an autonomous vehicle for personal use. Many noted that affordability is a main concern and would ultimately be a main determinant in their AV usage. Others discussed fare payment mechanisms and stressed that access would be expanded, including among the unbanked, if several payment methods were available, including cash, smart card, and payment via smartphone applications. Next slide, please. So to conclude, this study was truly an exciting and inspiring undertaking for our research team, as we were able to capture valuable primary data from adults with disabilities on perceptions, concerns, and recommendations related to autonomous vehicles. And most of us participating in today's forum are aware people with disabilities are a population whose mobility needs are too often not considered. Our findings demonstrate both the potential value of autonomous vehicles for transportation disadvantaged populations, as well as a strong interest in this technology among persons with disability. Looking ahead, it's clear that additional research must be performed with persons with diverse disabilities to ensure their needs are documented and considered as AV technology continues to advance. Such research will contribute immensely to efforts to ensuring this technology can offer a viable travel option for everyone. Next slide, please. Thank you all so much for listening, and thanks to the United States Access Board for convening this timely and important forum series.
We're now going to, hi, I'm Bruce Bailey. I'm on staff at the Access Board as an IT specialist. After each of our presentations, we're going to move into a kind of a moderated question mode where I'll be asking questions from the Q&A section. And again, we'll do this for each of the segments. One of the wrote in asking for some clarity on that the Ollie was actually, which is an autonomous vehicle, due to the legal constraints, you had to have an actual operator working that by joystick. And so was it clear, or was I'm assuming the impression for all of the riders was that it was an autonomous vehicle?
Thank you, Bruce. We did tell them there was staff members riding the vehicle as well as the operator, and we did tell them that the operator was operating them because of the conditions. So we didn't not disclose this to the participants. A lot of them understood what it eventually will become. I'm not sure if every participant was able to fully understand, but we did show some videos at the beginning and have a discussion before we even boarded the vehicle to give them an understanding of the technology. But we wanted to have them have the experience of riding one. And there was a lot of IRB conditions that required us to have it under these certain conditions, as well as the state laws. The last few pictures, there was on the street at National Harbor, a small group of us went down because due to IRB restrictions, we couldn't take pictures of the riders on board the vehicle. So we did have a small group with developmental disabilities go down for some photos to National Harbor to ride it on the street. And while that wasn't a study, there were really, when it was fully autonomous, there was absolutely no, I think it was just kind of normal for the participants that they didn't really see it. After a couple minutes, they were on their phones or just participating in regular activities that we would if we're on a bus or a paratransit vehicle.
This is Bruce again, and a related question if we saw in the chat was about having family members available, and that seems to tie into the answer you were just discussing, Cecilia. I wanted to ask you to expand on that just a little bit more.
I'll let Andrea start.
Sure. So we definitely heard from our participants with developmental disabilities that they would really prefer to have a family member, or I shouldn't say all of them, but several of them would prefer to have a family member on board, at least in the beginning, while they were getting used to riding, a new mode, such as an autonomous vehicle. But I mean, I think Cecilia communicated this. I mean, the excitement among the group was really just inspiring. They were just excited to be on board. They were interested in looking at the monitors on board and knowing what the communication interface, how they would be able to communicate with the AV, if at all. So I think the interest in having family members on board was really just for those initial days of getting used to riding a new mode.
And Bruce, I'd like to follow up that we also, we had a very short study time between, we had all the approvals for the IRB and when we could actually do the recruiting. And not everybody, we had to do it the days the vehicle was there for it was there for a conference. So a lot of the families that couldn't participate were very excited, parents with adult children of all ages, and they really saw this as a next step for them in their mobility challenges. A lot of people didn't have access to paratransit because of the buffer, or they didn't have, or the parents would be impacted. So we did receive a lot of emails from supportive families that necessarily couldn't participate in our study, but they really were excited that we were looking at this and that hopefully in the future, this would be an option for their family members.
And my last question, another sharp-eyed individual noticed that you didn't have any 165 and over in this particular study. And Andrea, I know you work on with aging population, so that does seem a little odd, but I'm guessing it's just who you had available.
Yeah, I think it was just, and Cecilia could add to this because she was the leader of our recruitment effort. And we wanted adults of all ages, but this is sort of, because we were focusing on folks with developmental disabilities and folks with visual impairment, we just did not have success in recruiting an older group, but that is definitely something we would be interested in doing, needs to be done because, AV would be potentially a wonderful transport option for older adults. So yes, it would be wonderful to talk with the older adults with and without disability.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm going to turn over the session to Sarah to introduce our next speaker. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. And we will move on to our next presenter, Dr. Robin Brewer. Dr. Brewer is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Information. She does research in human-computer interaction at the intersection of social computing and accessibility. Specifically, she designs, builds, and studies systems to better engage older adults and people with vision impairments who face barriers to accessing and engaging with technology. She also studies how people in these communities are actively engaging digitally and how researchers and designers can learn from their strengths. She holds a PhD in technology and social behavior from Northwestern University. Dr. Brewer, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for that awesome introduction, Sarah. Again, my name is Robin Brewer, and I am excited to be here today. As was mentioned, I am a professor at the University of Michigan in the School of Information. And today I'm going to present work done with my colleague, Nicole Ellison, over a 2-year period and focus on what we learned about designing autonomous and automated vehicles for blind and low vision people. What I will discuss today has been published in a few different papers, meaning I won't go into detail, but happy to answer questions in Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. Great. So I want to start with this quote that motivated the work that I will present today. A director at the National Federation of the Blind, or NFB, describes excitement around the potential of autonomous and automated transportation for blind people, saying, while blind people get around by using mass transit and other things, we don't have the flexibility the autonomous vehicles will present. And this quote distinguishes between public transportation and more direct modes of transportation, as public transportation is less flexible and causes a dependence on someone else, whereas autonomous vehicles promote independence, flexibility, and mobility. And we see this even more so now during COVID-19, where many public transportation options have had modified routes, decreased schedules and fleets, or have ceased altogether. So motivated by the potential of automated transportation, and next slide, please. And previous work done in this space, for example, with the National Federation of the Blind and their Blind Driver Challenge in 2009, my colleagues and I decided to continue momentum in autonomous vehicle research and renew attention to designing these types of vehicles for disabled people, specifically blind and low vision people. And doing so while we are still early in the vehicle design and adoption process, rather than thinking about accessibility later. Next slide. Great, so this presentation is split into two parts. In the first part, I describe findings from focus groups with blind and low vision people to understand and address some of the barriers to automated transportation. In the second part, I look at existing transportation experiences and ask what we might learn for designing AI-powered automated transportation by presenting findings from interviews with blind and low vision people that have experience as ride-sharing passengers and ride-sharing drivers who have experience driving disabled people. So first, we started our research by asking, how can we design accessible systems to support blind and low vision people with differing levels of control in automated vehicles? And by differing levels of control, I'm referring to semi-automated vehicles where the driver may be asked to intervene, and fully automated vehicles where there is no expectation of human intervention. To address this research question, we conducted two focus groups with about 15 blind and low vision people. The findings from this work were published at Assets, which is a conference on accessibility and computing. You can find this paper on my website, robinbrewer.com, and the bit.ly that is linked in the slides, but I'll also add them. I'll also link them in the chat for this webinar. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start by highlighting just a few findings from these interviews. So first, we observed how participants said things that went against what many vehicle designers and engineers might expect. So several participants who were blind preferred to use semi-automated vehicles, meaning these were vehicles where people may have to intervene and make some sort of driving decision in an emergency. So here, P14 is describing how he wanted the ability for you to take over and still have some type of tactile signals given to you and say, this is not working, this is not going to work, and you can still achieve your, independence. So for him and others, control means independence. And this desire for people who are blind or low vision to want in an automated vehicle sounds a bit counterintuitive. I'm getting a little feedback. It sounds like someone's microphone may be unmuted. So if you could mute, that'd be great. Thank you. So this control seems a little bit counterintuitive, but next slide. It's important to highlight to engineering companies and policymakers that blind and low vision people can have prior experiences with driving, and our data show how they can still feel connected to their identity as a driver. For example, one participant, P7, introduced himself to the group as a driver by saying, "That's what I did for a living as a transportation equipment operator for public transportation." And so many of our participants in these focus groups had driven before, acquiring vision loss due to age-related disability. On one of the previous slides, some of the statistics of participants were shown, and a lot of our participants were older. Our average age was, I believe, 59 years old, so they were a bit older. But also several participants mentioned driving even while being blind or low vision, which is technically illegal, but driving was a source of independence, which they wanted to keep. For example, this same participant, P7, said that he warms the car up, the vehicle, for my wife every day. I start it up and pull it out the garage, so it takes a skill to do that. And so this last part, it takes a skill to do that, shows that there is some pride in not just owning or being in a vehicle, but also being able to drive or be part of the process of operating a vehicle. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the second half of the focus group, we talked about the challenges of using autonomous and automated transportation. And participants were primarily concerned about control. So what happens if the vehicle malfunctions or misinterprets their actions? Participants expressed how these concerns would negatively affect their levels of trust and anxiety. So next, we asked participants to design solutions to these challenges around control. So the design component of the focus group confirmed a lot of common design approaches using voice and audio or tactile systems in vehicles. 3 participants actually described solutions that were directly inspired by existing assistive technologies, including refreshable braille displays, white canes, and screen readers. So in the quote on this screen, one participant says, "As you're driving with your hands at 10 and 2, you can use your thumbs. So it'll work kind of like a refreshable braille display that can move up as vehicles are approaching on the left and right." So in this example, the steering wheel is being used to convey information like where other vehicles are located in the environment. And then the image on the screen also shows a tactile solution to navigating unexpected obstacles. And a person described something similar to a white cane that many blind people use to navigate obstacles in their environments, but instead it would be a white cane for the vehicle to navigate obstacles while driving. Next slide. So these design sessions suggest that there are ways that we could leverage existing frameworks, experiences, assistive technologies for designing automated transportation. And not only do we need to focus on vehicle design, but the overall process, which, as I believe was hinted to in the previous presentation, will increasingly use AI for driving and for scheduling rides. And so in this second study, we focus on what we can learn from ride sharing, as it is a mode of transportation that is most similar to autonomous and automated transportation. And the ride sharing model is also being used to frame models of automated transportation use where people will not own a car. Instead, a vehicle will show up similar to an Uber or a Lyft and will take people where they need to go and hence be shared across riders. So to answer this research question, we interviewed 16 blind and low vision ride-sharing passengers and 18 ride-sharing drivers with experiences driving blind and low vision people and other passengers with disabilities. Next slide. And from these interviews, we learned more about the importance of drivers in doing more than operating a vehicle. So when discussing automated transportation, researchers often focus on the trip itself, yet participants spoke at length about how driver assistance was important when entering and exiting vehicles, so before the trip starts. And often this is referred to as the last mile problem. So for example, one participant said, well, sometimes they can't see where you are, referring to ride sharing drivers. They think you can see them and you tell them you can't. For example, I waited out by my garage before and a guy swore he was at my house. And I said, you're not at my house because I'm at the garage. He goes, I'm at the garage. I said, no, you're not because I'm right here. And he drove around and he finally saw me. So in this quote, we see how a conversation with the driver is required almost for being able to enter the vehicle because the navigation system that was directing the driver to the passenger's home was inaccurate. Next slide. And similarly, from interviewing drivers, we learn about the types of labor they perform, including physical labor that may be outside of the request from sighted passengers. For example, one driver described how a passenger said, I've got a few things to move, would you mind helping me? The driver then grabs the boxes, takes them into and up the stairs of the passenger's apartment and says, I would have done it if you wouldn't have asked, I would have offered. And then the passenger asks, would you let me hold onto your arm and walk me around the room so that I can memorize where everything is at? So they start to walk around and the driver is actually, the ride sharing driver is being asked to help the passenger use his thermostat in his home and tell him what each button is for. So this interaction, it's rare, but it does happen. And it's important to note that this required the passenger to disclose their disability to the driver. Next slide. And drivers actually expected passengers to disclose their disabilities as it helped them know how to assist or how much to assist. For example, one driver said it would be nice to know ahead of time, but we also see that drivers also understand that passengers might not want to disclose this information because they could be discriminated against and drivers could, quote, take advantage of them. So companies like Uber and Lyft have policies for serving people with different disabilities, and we may expect that some of these policies could inform the design of automated vehicles to support disabled passengers. So the question then becomes, if we replace the human driver with AI or some artificial intelligence or some automated system, does this make the problem of discriminating against disabled passengers go away? And we argue that the answer is no. And we know this from other contexts like employment or the judicial system, that algorithms that make these AI-powered technologies work, they're not magically bias-free. In fact, algorithms that use social data as training data often embed the same biases as humans. We know that companies like HireVue unintentionally discriminated against disabled people with video interview software. And its algorithm was more likely to discriminate against people who didn't have, quote, traditional social behaviors. We've also seen this in the context of race and recidivism rates or gender and hiring. So in the case of automated vehicles, we can imagine that if you have an algorithm determining who gets picked up and when, that the design of the algorithm might be that it's optimized for efficiency. So disabled passengers who take longer to get into and out of cars might be deprioritized or penalized in some way. So this leads to an open design question of how to consider the design of fair and inclusive algorithms for automated vehicles. So to summarize, in both parts of today's talk, I emphasize how designing more inclusive automated experiences is not solely about getting to one's destination, and that there are many social components. In the first part of the presentation, I focused on perceptions of automated vehicles from blind and low vision people, showing how not everyone was comfortable with fully automated vehicles and being unable to control a vehicle. And so this shows how control preferences are a spectrum among blind and low vision people, and likely others with and even without disabilities. So how can we engage with engineers and policymakers to rethink control as a spectrum and whether it should be a choice. And then also, how might we leverage more assistive technology metaphors when designing in-vehicle systems to support control? And then in the second part of the presentation, I described a model of transportation that's similar to automated vehicles, and that is ride sharing. From interviews with passengers and drivers, we show that some driver role is still critical in an automated vehicle, even with advanced indoor and outdoor navigation technologies. And we show that many ride-sharing drivers rely on blind and low vision people to disclose their disabilities to better support their needs. Yet we also warn that these practices can be discriminatory with or without a driver. So therefore, we recommend that researchers be careful to not amplify existing algorithmic bias against people with disabilities. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brewer. This is Bruce again. I'm only going to ask one question to make sure we have time to get back at the open discussion portion. So we had a couple questions come into the chat about summoning an AV versus summoning a ride sharing. I'm assuming they're about the same, but maybe people aren't familiar with that. But also, you gave the examples of the dialogue, the interaction between a passenger and a human driver. How optimistic are you for that working when when the driver's a computer? And then and you also talked about even locating the vehicle in front of your house. What about locating the vehicle, I don't know, in a parking lot or pick up at an airport kind of thing? Thank you. And I don't know if that's a complicated question for 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I was comparing the future of automated transportation to ride sharing. So you could imagine that similar to an Uber or Lyft, one could also request a ride from an automated vehicle in that same way. So that was more so setting up a similarity between ride sharing and automated transportation. Now, there was a question about the conversational component as well, and how that would work without a human driver being in a vehicle. And we think that there are opportunities where we could borrow from existing assistive technologies. There's IRA, which is basically a heads-up display where you interact with an agent who's on another end, right? And so we think there might be opportunities for humans to still play some type of driver role without being in the actual car itself, right? So can these vehicles have video conferencing technologies or audio conferencing technologies that would allow someone remotely to still be able to assist with things like entry or exit work or answer questions while in a vehicle? So I think that answered the questions. If there was one that I was missing, do let me know.
Well, I think the question might have been, that people are you typically it's an app on your mobile phone. I don't know if there's any other way to hail for ride sharing besides that. I guess you could try and do it on a tablet, but typically you need the Wi-Fi, you need the cellular connection, really.
Exactly, right. So that could be needing cellular connection could be a limitation of this ride sharing model for automated transportation. But as we see ride sharing growing more, we do think that this would be a more affordable approach to using an automated vehicle as opposed to needing to purchase your own. So that sharing model does help cut the cost a bit.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer. Back to you, Sarah, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bruce and Dr. Brewer. And now to hear more about the issues of autonomous vehicles for persons who are blind or visually impaired from a different perspective, we will now hear from Anil Lewis. Anil Lewis is the Executive Director for Blindness Initiatives for the National Federation of the Blind, or NFB. He coordinates outreach, marketing, and fundraising activities for NFB, leading a dynamic team of individuals responsible for the creation, development, implementation, and replication of innovative projects and programs throughout a nationwide network of affiliates that work to positively affect the education, employment, and quality of life for all blind people. In his previous role as the Director of Strategic Communications for NFB, Mr. Lewis coordinated the public relations campaign for the NFB's Blind Driver Challenge, an innovative research project to develop non-visual access technology that made it possible for a blind person to safely and independently operate an automobile. Mr. Lewis holds a master's degree in public administration from Georgia State University. And Mr. Lewis, the microphone is now yours.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'd like to express my appreciation to the Access Board for putting together this particular forum as we move more toward the implementation and integration of autonomous vehicles into our lives. I think the education component is key if we're going to not only just develop the technology, but also introduce the policies that are going to be necessary for it to be a viable option. And I'm really pleased that I'm following Dr. Brewer. I think that what I have to offer here may actually complement the previous presentation. So I want to talk to you about non-visual access to autonomous vehicles, because we are the National Federation of the Blind, and blindness is where we have our expertise. And as you just stated, sir, in the introduction, we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary of when we developed non-visual interfaces that allowed a blind person to actually drive a car on the Daytona International Speedway. If you go to blinddriverchallenge.org, you can see that demonstration. I was debating on whether to use slides, but I think that what I want to do is to take you all on a virtual autonomous vehicle ride non-visually. Now, many people would say, well, close your eyes. Well, I don't want you to close your eyes, because that's what it's like to go blind, but that's not what it's like to be blind. Blind people who get the proper training and acquire the skill sets really still use a lot of mental mapping so that they really do kind of metaphorically see what's going on. So I want you to go with me on this virtual trip using your mind's eye mental mapping as I describe the experience. And what I'd like to do is integrate some of the non-visual components that we've talked to automobile manufacturers, researchers about. Because of our work with the Blind Driver Challenge, we have a lot of cachet with a lot of the individuals and entities that are developing autonomous vehicles now. We have also actively participated in a lot of the research. So my virtual experience is going to be using kind of a fleet model experience. As Dr. Brewer was mentioning, we already heard about the public transportation scenario that was described by Ollie and Local Motors. So I want you to work with me through the point of requesting the trip, getting in the vehicle, and arriving at your destination. And I want to integrate some of the components. So requesting the trip, it's always been talked about a little bit. The ride sharing does provide a real viable scenario by which this would work. So the same way you would order a Lyft or an Uber or any other ride sharing option using a smartphone, we know that that's viable because the individual put in a destination where they need to be picked up, those types of things. And the only thing we have to make sure here with respect to non-visual accessibility is that the app is accessible. And we're coming more and more into a place with our relationships with Google and Apple, et cetera, that coding apps in a way that they're accessible will hopefully become enculturated in the work that everybody does. So having access to that app so that they can put in the necessary information to request a trip will be the way that you request it. For those individuals who are not quite technologically savvy, we still think that there should be some type of telephone means of doing it, right? So that someone could actually call, maybe speak to a customer service agent, or if they can integrate some type of automated way using their touchtone system, whatever, but there should be a non kind of technically savvy way of ordering the vehicle. And I know that many of you who are jumping ahead are thinking that's going to create a problem. Well, hopefully I can address that as I move forward. The next obstacle or option to address is locating the vehicle. So several things that you can come into play. If we move to a fleet model, chances are the people who are providing this as an option are going to buy vehicles at volume. So this is not just an issue for blind individuals. This is probably going to be an issue for everybody who's taking advantage of this as a service. A fleet model may purchase 50 black Toyota Camrys. So how are you going to know when those 3 show up in your front door, which one is yours? So we talked about how could we do that in a non-visual fashion. So we talked about several different options. So one was that the individual, through using the app, could actually activate the horn for the automobile to blow the horn, and they can locate it audibly that way. We discussed that may actually victimize some individuals who are using that service, because other individuals in that environment could see that that person's relying on that noise to get there. It could be modified so that it's not just a perpetual horn noise, but more of a Marco Polo kind of style, where you would hit it, it would chirp, and you'd move in that direction. As you get closer, you could make it sound off again, it would chirp. So not as obvious and not as prolonged. One of the other options we said that would reduce the noise is use it more like the hot potato, cold potato, using haptic vibrations in the smartphone. So it vibrates, increases as you get closer or move toward the vehicle, and it decreases as you end up moving away from the vehicle. This was also a good option for individuals who were deafblind, because they'd be able to take advantage of the vibral tactile means of accessing that information. So we talked about that. And of course, for those individuals who requested the vehicle using some telephone service, they would need somebody on site, personal care assistant, maybe help them get to the vehicle. So those are some of the things we talked about, some of the options that we proposed. Entering the vehicle, I think, is one that still has yet to be pointed out. That's going to be an even greater consideration, because right now we're still looking at vehicles that are designed in the traditional way that cars are made. Just to give you a little insight on some training, as a blind person, when I approach a vehicle, I can orient based on the ambient noise that the car creates. And if I take my cane and I angle it in a way that I can slide it along the side of the automobile, as I slide back and I hit that back tire, tracing my cane vertically up will lead me right to that handle in the door. So it's not magic. It's just a matter of training and learning how to do things. So entering an existing vehicle is probably not going to be as much of a problem. But we may move to a place where autonomous vehicles who don't have steering wheels may be designed in a way that the door is in the rear, or maybe even in the front. Cars are not oriented facing forward. They may be facing backwards or sideways. So there may be some additional consideration given to how does the person enter the vehicle once the vehicle design changes. So once the person's in the vehicle, though, that is a concern. How does the person get oriented to the vehicle? Because autonomous vehicle is going to have some functionality within it, hopefully, that doesn't exist in vehicles today. Maybe there's an opportunity for pre-orientation of an individual. Maybe a person can be talked through what the experience would be like over a phone as they sign up for the service. Maybe that's a training that they participate in. One of the other options we talked about with one of our vehicle manufacturers is, what if in all the vehicles there was an automated audio description that you could either say you want or not. So as you enter the vehicle, there could be sensors in place that says, welcome to this particular experience. For this, you will see these controls on your right or in the front of you, or you can do this. Just an audio description. And if you don't need it, after you've written it a couple of times, you can just disable it by saying, no, thank you. So getting those types of things in place to orient a person around the vehicle may be something that's needed. Vehicle controls is one thing we've talked a lot about. So how does a person interact with whatever controls they may have in the vehicle? We're old school, so tactile knobs and buttons still work for us. Don't require a whole lot of ingenuity. You can put some symbols or some of those tactile interfaces around it to make sure that people know what the purpose is. But we've also recognized we've been able to master the touchscreen technology too, through gestures, et cetera, through iPhone, tablets, et cetera. So those are also options. But the other way, of course, that's more conducive to helping everyone is just an audio interface. Can you talk to the vehicle? Can you give it audio commands? And as we look at a lot of the Google and the Amazon implementations of voice technologies, that's not unreasonable. It's something that's really viable and could be used. So in using these controls, whether it be knobs, touchscreen, or voice, what does the passenger get to control? Was a lot of the things we were talking about. So does the person control the temperature of the vehicle? I think that makes sense. Does the person control the radio? Many people now kind of carry around their music or audiobook options on whatever portable device they have, but if the car has a radio system, will the passenger be able to control that audio? Other options, can you control the ability for the vehicle to stop? And I don't mean like an emergency stop, just if you want to stop for whatever reason, if you need to get out of the car, you're not feeling well, whatever, will the person have the control to stop? And will the passenger have the ability to change the destination? We talked about how you would order it, putting in a destination using kind of the rideshare model, but will you be able to change the destination? I can do that when I'm catching my Lyft or my Uber. So it seems reasonable that you could do it in an autonomous vehicle experience. The other things we talked about is as you're riding on this virtual experience, what information would you want as you're riding? Do you want information about the current location? I personally like to know that, because even when I'm riding in rideshare options now, I can tell when the driver is going the wrong way if I know where I am. So if they're making a right on Lawrence when I know they're supposed to keep straight on Fort, then I can give that feedback and correct it. Will that be a means by which you could do that with an autonomous vehicle? That would be a deeper discussion, but at a minimum, you wouldn't want to know your current location. The other thing is, do you want points of interest? I also think that's very helpful for mental mapping. So as you're moving through, getting to street destinations, you might say, well, we're passing TJ Applebee's. We just passed the Department of Motor Vehicles. So giving that information as you move along is also a consideration. Take this time real quick to talk about something that Dr. Brewer said. A lot of this is, I guess, interpreted as degrees of control of the vehicle, but whatever control is available, the thing that we've been stressing with a lot of our partners is it needs to be customizable, right? Because as we're even talking about this, people are making decisions, well, yeah, they should, and no, they shouldn't. Well, that's your personal preference. There are individuals who would rather have the points of interest, but don't even care about the location information, and vice versa. So we stress that it should be a way, when it's possible, for it to be customized. So you've gone on this virtual trip, you've gotten the information that you wanted, you control the car in the way that you want to, and you've arrived at your destination. Where am I? Is that the autonomous vehicle's responsibility? I heard some discussion in the previous presentations around, individuals who felt comfortable about certain things and uncomfortable about certain things. And I think we have to be careful about what should be a consideration in the design of an autonomous vehicle. If we can do it in a way that provided that not only door-to-door service, but office-to-office experience, the way that Dr. Brewer was describing, that one of the Lyft or Uber drivers help the person orient themselves in the home. I think that's a big, broad expectation when we're talking about AV. We encourage our researchers, as they're interacting with individuals that are blind or have low vision, which I really, really push, because I think that that's when you get the real skinny. But we caution them to also try to ask information around the skill set of that individual. Have they received training on how to travel independently? Because a lot of that is going to affect the way that they respond to their degree of confidence and their feeling of safety. And sometimes you're not going to be able to help or offset a person who is just simply afraid to travel. And you don't want that to interfere with your research in a way that may dispel the validity of an option, or may require you to try to add something as a feature that may not necessarily be required by others who have that degree of confidence. I also would state that a lot of times we've talked about when you've reached your destination, how do you get from the vehicle actually to the building that you're going to, and then the office that you're going to visit. Autonomous vehicle may not be the answer, but integrating the use of the autonomous vehicle with the other services, one IRA is what Dr. Brewer mentioned, but also Be My Eyes, which is actually a free service, can also have a virtual sighted assistant give a person information. So by holding up a smartphone or by using the glasses or whatever, a sighted person, not even at the location, can look through that camera and give information to an individual to try to find their space. But we do encourage that, recognizing that the responsibility for a lot of this actually falls on the individual. Of course, that's only possible when the technology is designed that gives that individual the ability to exercise their capacity, their intellect, in order to get done what they need done. So I'm really, again, happy that this discussion is taking place. Really good feedback that we've been getting from our interaction. I love the previous presenters and looking forward to the other presentations. And I'd be happy to take whatever questions Bruce may throw my way.
Thank you very much, Anil Lewis. Bruce Bailey again, and I'm sorry to say we're gonna skip the questions for this session, your session, and the next session, and go right into open discussion after our next presenter.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. I'm always so paranoid that I'm not unmuted. Okay, our last presenter for today's session will be Dr. Christian Vogler. Dr. Vogler is a professor in the School of Science, Technology, Accessibility, Mathematics, and Public Health at Gallaudet University, and he is the director of the Technology Access Program Research Group. He leads and co-leads multiple research grants that focus on accessible technology for the deaf and hard of hearing. Topics of these include video relay services, caption telephone services, closed caption for TV and streaming video, better consumer control over hearing aids and cochlear implants, next generation smart home alerting systems, and the accessibility of voice interfaces. He holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Pennsylvania. Okay, Dr. Vogler, you're welcome. Take it away.
Terrific. Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Before I start, I do want to emphasize a couple of points that have come up thus far. When we look at research into autonomous vehicles and accessibility, there is very little out there specifically on the deaf and hard of hearing experience. So there is some mention of deaf and hard of hearing people and their experience with AVs, but typically we have to look to other research and integrate it into what we're looking at rather than having specific research based on our community. So that's what I'll be doing today, is giving you some of the research questions we're looking at, but also to stress the need that we do need specific research on deaf and hard of hearing people's experiences. Okay. So once upon a time, as you may know, deaf people were actually barred from driving. Thankfully, we have become a little wiser about this in the US context, and deaf and hard of hearing people are allowed to drive. However, in some other countries in the world, deaf and hard of hearing people are still prohibited from driving, and that discrimination exists still. So I think our questions today for discussion apply to autonomous vehicles as well as it does to deaf people and driving typical traditional cars. So we need to think about providing functional equivalence for deaf and hard of hearing persons with respect to using autonomous vehicles. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So functional equivalence is primarily about communication for the deaf and hard of hearing community. To that end, I'm going to touch on three aspects of communication that warrant attention. First, how do you tell the autonomous vehicle what you need it to do? So, for example, how do you tell it where you want to go? How do you tell it to look for a particular restaurant that you'd like to stop at that is perhaps deaf-friendly and has good access components? How do you communicate with the AV? How does it tell me where I'm going? For example, if we need to take a detour because of traffic or other road conditions, perhaps there's a road closure, how does the AV communicate that with me as a user? And then in the event that there is an emergency of some description, how is the deaf and hard of hearing user alerted to that? And thirdly, AVs aren't self-contained bubbles, as you may know. You will want and potentially even need to communicate with the outside world inside the AV. So in-car communication systems are proliferating. How do we make sure that within those AV systems, deaf and hard of hearing people have access to that communication? If I could have the next slide, please. So let's talk first about communicating with the autonomous vehicle. One of the biggest drivers at the moment of in-car communications is voice interfaces, things along the lines of Siri, Google Assistant, Alexa. And that can be potentially wonderful and very convenient, but also very frustrating in some ways. They can be terrific because you don't get distracted the same way you might if you were looking at a keyboard to text. However, if you are not a person who uses their voice, then obviously these voice interfaces like Siri and Alexa are not going to be effective. There's also the question of deaf and hard of hearing people having an accent. If you have such an accent, again, these voice activated systems might not work for you. So for example, if I'm using Alexa in a quiet environment and I offer simple commands, Alexa can typically work with that. But if I have more complex commands or it's a noisy environment, all of that breaks down and Alexa is no longer successful. So with that in mind, it is absolutely critical that we design research that gives us full-featured, safe, and effective alternatives to voice. To that end, at Gallaudet University, we right now have engaged in a research project that's looking into the feasibility of a limited set of gestures, signs, and tactile methods, which would replace voice commands and control. Now, we haven't looked at the vehicles specifically. That's not under our remit at this stage, but it could certainly be considered if we get appropriate industry support and willingness to partner in that kind of enterprise. And also, I just mentioned we're looking at the feasibility of a limited set of gestures, signs, and tactile methods. That's because more general purpose technology for gestures and sign language interfaces are a long way off. We are simply not there yet. But we can work with limited sets in terms of what today's technology currently offers. If I could have the next slide, please. So for communication, which several of my colleagues have spoken about, and you might have noticed that cars are pretty chatty these days. They seem to have a lot to say. And I certainly expect that autonomous vehicles are also going to be chatty. So you might be surprised to know that from a deaf standpoint, we are often surprised at how much information is conveyed by voice in a device inside a car. For example, if you listen to or even caption Google Maps, you'll realize that there is a lot more spoken information than visual information. For example, on which lane to be in, when and where to turn, which exit to take, etc. So that says we absolutely require appropriate visual information if it's to be functionally equivalent for deaf and hard of hearing users. But we also recognize that we don't want the visual modality to be then overloaded with information or to cause a distraction within the autonomous vehicle space. So for us, this is an area ripe for research. We don't currently have that kind of research available. We want to figure out how and when we display the right kind of information, the relevant information, how we prioritize that information and still get functionally equivalent service. Again, an area for more research. Another important consideration that we see getting systematically overlooked for people who use hearing aids and cochlear implants is how they get an effective, clean audio feed to their device. Background noise in vehicles, as you may imagine, especially if you're going fast, can cause background noise that make it harder to understand or get a clean feed from the communication from the autonomous vehicle. So it's really critical that we consider direct communication options for hearing aids. Direct connection options, however, often overlook some other issues. So if you're in an autonomous vehicle and there is a mix of passengers, some deaf, some hard of hearing, and some hearing, in that environment, we're typically restricted to simply one method. I can either choose direct communication, which goes perhaps to the fellow passengers, or which means also that the speakers don't work, or I can get the information from the autonomous vehicle, but I can no longer hear my fellow passengers. So what that means is that future design has to be fully integrating the idea of multiple audio output options. and they should be supported in parallel. Next slide, please. This brings me to the point about in-vehicle communication systems. At this stage, they are typically designed from an audio perspective, which makes them inherently inaccessible. It works similarly for phone calls and even voice playback of messages. It's all audio-based. Conversely, when you think about communication options outside the vehicle, they are typically also restricted to a voice-based mechanism. And there may certainly be safety reasons for some of this, including, for example, the idea that one ought not use text while driving. That's certainly possible. I can't talk to you right now. We just have to ensure that we are continuing to provide audio communication options in accessible ways and to reconsider what this looks like to ensure that functional equivalence is happening, which includes interfaces for communication that are audio, but also video and text capabilities. And these interfaces for communication need to include accessibility for deaf and hard of hearing people in all of the ways that work for them. And they cannot be simply voice activated only. We have to consider other methodologies and other strategies for ensuring functionally equivalent communication as autonomous vehicles progress. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vogler. And we're gonna go right now into the open discussion.
Bruce, I'm sorry, one moment, please. Can we have an interpreter on screen?
Thank you so much, Dr. Vogler. We're going to go right.
Can we have Dr. Vogler on screen, please?
We're going to go jump right down into the open discussion forum. Please, again, if be clear in your Q&A if you want to ask the question live, or if you want me to voice the question for you. So we've got people working on the back end to have you on the queue. I'll try to be clear about who's up. We will be unmuting you in the Zoom platform, but you may have to unmute your phone. And you can also send in an email request at events@accessboard.gov. And if we can turn on your camera and promote you to a panelist if you want to ask your question in ASL. And we will be limiting comments to 2 minutes. We have about 13 minutes for the whole session. And Dr. Vogler, first thing I wanted to ask you is about if an autonomous vehicle has some sort of in-computer screen or kiosk, you talked that these things would probably have a camera facing the passenger. They already have cameras in a lot of these cars. Your optimism for that working as an interface, or would you rather have a touchscreen? Would you rather have a physical keyboard? What are some ideas for command and control, if you will, once you're in the vehicle?
Thanks for that question, Bruce. This is Christian Vogler. I think that when we're looking at the interface within the vehicle, monitors would have potentially great accessibility. We'd have to think about the size of them and about the information that they portray for deaf and hard of hearing users. So with that in mind, I guess some of the concerns that arise from that are that monitors, tablets, etc., don't have universal design yet. So how people actually interface with them would be a question. In the design, we'd have to make sure that the screen is provided in a way that also allows for people who are not using sign language and who are sighted, for example, and so that the controls are accessible. It's also possible that too many controls could be overwhelming for the rider. So we need to be careful about the balance in that design of where each part of information that's considered integral is put. What information can be hidden behind a menu, what options should be foremost. So those are some considerations I would recommend.
Thank you very much. And I apologize to the audience. I've already missed on my next thing. Christian Fitzgerald, you're going to be up in just 1 minute, and then we'll go to Daryl Cooper. So Christian Fitzgerald, if you're ready to ask your question or make your comment, please go ahead, and I'll go off camera as soon as you start talking.
Okay, my name is Christine Fitzgerald. But anyway, so to make it a bit more of a challenge, I'm physically and visually impaired at the same time. I use a power chair. And some things we need to recognize is the simple fact that folks really are challenged in any number of ways, and sometimes we're challenged in more than one way. I'm fascinated by the discussion that we went through a little bit about how does the vehicle recognize, for example, an emergency vehicle? And I'm going to add something on top of that. And so let's say, for whatever reason, you have to pull over to the side of the road. If I needed to get out, would the van, recognize that it needed to deploy a ramp? And how would that work, let's say, on a given freeway, highway, whatever, because I need extra room in order to be able to have the ramp drop and then me get out.
So this is Bruce again, and I'm not providing as much maybe traffic direction as I could, but if one of our panelists would like to respond to that, please put your camera on and unmute your mic.
This is Anil. I would offer, and the first presenter may have more information, but when we were looking at the Ollie device that Local Motors is developing, one of the interesting things that they were saying was they could create kind of profiles for the individual passenger and have that profile communicated to the vehicle in a way that the vehicle would know all of the different multiple ways that they may want it customized, or it may need to meet some type of accommodation need. The other scenarios that the participant was talking about, those are things that I think we can hypothesize and plan for them, giving some limited ability for the passenger to make adjustments as necessary to deal with those unforeseen circumstances. But I think that with most AI, it is learning technology. So as we incur more and more of those experiences and recognize that they need to be dealt with, they will hopefully be integrated into the systems.
Thank you very much, Christine, for your question. And thank you, Neil Lewis, for addressing that. Next, I'd like to ask Daryl Cooper to unmute your microphone.
Hi, this is Daryl Cooper. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Access Board, for hosting this. I had a question for Dr. Cecilia Fili and Andrea Lubin. I think in your presentation, you had talked about your focus group had asked about using their own phones so they could call the car manufacturer or the car customer service if they had questions about the ride, if they wanted to stop the car, that sort of thing. Did they express a personal preference to use their own phones for that communication? I was wondering, if the car has a built-in communication device, which I think all these will, do you think there might be some hesitation to use a communication device that's built into the car? Would that might be a disincentive for people in your focus group to ride the car?
Daryl, I'll just quickly jump in and then Cecilia will add if I'm missing something, but I think folks that we spoke to at our focus groups are very interested in using their own phone to schedule trips. But I think they were very open to using whatever communication interface was on board the vehicle to, reach out for help, or if they needed assistance, whether it's an internal emergency event in the car or an external event. So I don't think there was any hesitation to using the communication interface, provided it was accessible and they could do so, but they were very interested in using their own cellular phones to schedule the trip.
Yes, I agree with what Andrea said, that they I think the assumption was that they would be able to interface directly with the vehicles, whatever possible way that they commonly communicated. Not everybody at our focus groups communicated verbally. We did have people who communicated with other means. So I think everybody was just anticipating that how they communicated would be able to be done with the emerging technology.
This is Bruce again. Thank you very much. And we're going to try and do 2 more questions. And again, I neglected to queue people up. So Eve Bowe, if you're ready to speak, please go ahead, or Ron Brooks. Eve Bowe or Ron Brooks.
Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
So I think I just wanted to.
I'm sorry, who's this?
This is Ron Brooks.
Should I go or?
Yeah, you go first.
Okay. I just wanted to request that the environmentally disabled people have a seat at the table when it comes to these issues and all issues to access, because we are a growing population because of the chemical and electromagnetic assault in the environment. And particularly when it comes to the issue you're talking about today, so many of the technologies are reliant on wireless radiation. And this is extremely detrimental to this group of disabled Americans. And so while we can see that, I'm sure it would benefit some people in some ways to have this wireless, and they're willing to be exposed to this amount of radiation, it just precludes this entire class of people from access to public transportation, especially when it comes to autonomous vehicles. There are solutions. A lot of this can be hardwired as opposed to wireless. And this is one thing that's going to have to be done. And we would really like to be joined into the discussion, on this issue. And so I hope we can find a means of doing that. So basically, with the chemicals and the wireless, whether it's phones, there can be signs up so that people know, so that Uber drivers know that this is a disability, that there can be requests to have cell phones turned off during rides and ride shares and public transportation. And basically, I just wanted to put in that request, and I can submit my information so that I can be contacted. And I hope we can join in on the discussion so that we are not left out and that our civil rights to access are seen. So thank you very much.
Bruce again. Thank you, Eve Bowe. Brooks, can you, I'm sorry, can you make your comment in 1 minute? And I'm sorry, we won't be able to get an answer from you from any of our panelists.
Yeah, yes, I can. So a lot of the conversation has been around the subject of control, and I included a comment in the conversation in the Q&A. I think that the issue of control is interesting, but I think that as we look at levels of automation, it seems like the industry is moving more towards higher levels of automation, and I think that we should really think about control inside the context of higher levels of automation. And because there's so many moving parts to try to manage at once, I'd rather see us aim for where we want to end up rather than aiming for where the technology is starting, which is kind of transitional levels of automation like a Tesla. And the other comment is I'm hearing all the different people talk is this issue of intersectionality between different types of disabilities is something that I think we need to think about. This plays into the whole concept of equity. Having a call center, having the ability to have features hardwired and not just wireless. I think those are all things that we really need to spend some time on. And I hope that we can get to the point where we're doing broader research across the whole disability community and not focusing within segments of the community, specifically, by type of disability, but we really think about these issues kind of more universally and survey that way. That's all.
Thank you, Ron Brooks. I think that's a great way to close out the session. But Sarah, would you take us out?
Okay, thank you, Bruce. And I would like to thank everyone for attending today's session. We had some good discussion, maybe not as much as we had hoped because this is such a huge topic and we had such a packed agenda, but it's still been really good. But as I mentioned earlier, the conversation does continue online at transportationinnovation.ideascale.com, where you can contribute ideas, comment on other people's ideas, and vote on ideas. If we weren't able to get to your comment or question today, please enter it on this online dialogue so that it can be part of the conversation. If you need any assistance using IdeaScale platform, please contact ePolicyWorks@dol.gov. And now I would like to thank our presenters, Cecilia Fili, Andrea Lubin, Robin Brewer, Anil Lewis, and Christian Vogler. And I would like to thank everyone else who helped to make this event possible today, or hopefully everyone else. Okay. And that would include the Director of the Office of Technical and Information Services here at the Access Board, Dave Yanchulis, our friends at the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the Department of Labor, including Lindsay Teal, and the support team there that's been helping us with our online dialogue, including Danielle Germain and Hope Adler. And there are other people here at the Access Board working behind the scenes that we need to thank, including Francis Spiegel, Phil Bratta, and Bill Botten. And of course, I got to give another thank you to Bruce Bailey, our fearless moderator. So thank you very much, Bruce. Next slide, please. Our next session will be held on April 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Our presenters for that session will be Dr. Aaron Steinfeld from Carnegie Mellon University, Dr. Greg Vanderheiden from the University of Maryland and the Trace Center, our own Bruce Bailey here at the Access Board, Daryl Cooper from the Federal Communication Commission, and Ted Guild from the W3C. If you have not already done so, please register for this event on our website. Each Zoom session is a separate link, so you have to register for the sessions you want to attend. You can't assume that if you registered for one, then you registered for them all. We're looking forward to hearing from you again in 2 weeks. Next slide. Thanks again for attending and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is Rosemary, U.S. Access Board, and I wish to thank also interpreters Jackie, Antonio, and Ashley. Thank you so